Welcome back, dear friends and fellow lovers of stories, myth, and meaning. I'm so glad you're here. You know, every time I sit down to share a film with you, I like to imagine we're gathered in a cozy little salon of ideas, where literature enthusiasts and seekers of intellectual adventures come together. Think of it like a circle of friends who never tire of diving beneath the surface of what popular entertainment shows us. Before we wander into today's discussion, may I gently ask that you like and subscribe? It means a lot. It helps this little community grow, and it lets me know you want more of these reflective, soul-nourishing explorations. I say this with sincerity. I want our conversations to be about insight, not algorithms, and every gesture of support is a way of saying, yes, keep going. And here's something important to remember before we begin. What follows is not a traditional review in the sense of thumbs up or thumbs down. This is not about rating or recommending. It is, instead, a theoretical and critical analysis, a kind of educational, imaginative exercise. If you're here, it's likely because you love literature, myth, and philosophy as much as film, and you know that the boundaries between them are thin, perhaps even illusory. So let's let ourselves wander. Let's think about what cinema is capable of when it dares to retell a myth, when it risks reimagining gods and mortals and the vast tapestry of human yearning. The film we're entering into is, in so many ways, strange and imperfect. And yet, I must admit, it has always fascinated me. Maybe it's because when I first encountered it, I was at a stage in my life where I wanted escape, not just entertainment, but escape into something larger than myself. I remember sitting in a darkened theater, half skeptical and half hopeful, wondering what this glossy, CGI-laden interpretation of ancient myth would bring. And though I noticed the flaws, though I could sense the unevenness, I also found myself strangely moved. The grandiosity, the audacity, the sheer attempt to bring a mythological cosmos onto the screen, it felt like a reminder that storytelling is always an act of faith. The movie itself is a modern spectacle draped in the robes of the ancient world. It takes the old Egyptian myths, stories of gods walking among men, of cosmic battles between order and chaos, and reframes them through the lens of blockbuster cinema. The production is lavish, unapologetically over the top, and in some ways excessive to the point of absurdity. And yet, as someone who has always loved myths, the way they bend time and blur the line between metaphor and reality, I couldn't help but admire its boldness. There's something almost childlike about it, the way a child might pick up pieces of myth and say, look, here is a god, here is a battle, here is a kingdom of the dead, and weave them together without hesitation. At its core, the story is deceptively simple. A god, betrayed by his kin, falls from grace. A mortal, fragile but determined, rises up against impossible odds. The fate of kingdoms, and indeed the cosmos, hangs on their uneasy alliance. This is, in one sense, the oldest story we know, the fall and the rise, the betrayal and the redemption, the collision between the eternal and the human. And yet, clothed in the particular details of this film, it becomes a peculiar mirror of our own longings. We want heroes larger than life, but we also want them flawed. We want gods, but we also want to see them bleed. The first time I saw the protagonist's journey, I found myself strangely thinking of my own youth, of times when I felt powerless, and yet was urged by circumstances to confront something larger, something that terrified me. The idea of a mortal caught up in divine games resonated, because haven't we all felt, at some point, that the forces shaping our lives are impossibly vast and uncaring? Whether it's bureaucracy, fate, or the randomness of loss, there's a universal human sense that we are pawns in a game beyond our understanding. And so the film's story became more than myth to me. It became allegory. There are moments of spectacle, cityscapes that gleam with impossible architecture, battles that roar with the weight of eternity. But what lingers for me are the smaller details, the quieter beats. A god, blinded and shamed, learning humility. A mortal, grieving yet defiant, choosing to risk everything for love. A kingdom caught between tyranny and the hope of renewal. These are archetypes, yes, but they are also reflections of our own hearts. When I watch them unfold, I think of how myths have always functioned, not as history, not as fact, but as truth wrapped in narrative clothing. The film teases its twists with a kind of operatic flair. You think you know who will triumph, and yet alliances shift. The god who seems broken finds hidden reserves of courage. The villain who seems unstoppable reveals his own wounds, his own desperate hunger for power that can never be satisfied. And all the while, the mortal thread of the story, the fragile human love story at its center, reminds us why any of it matters. Because without love, without connection, even the most glittering kingdoms are hollow. When I reflect on it now, years later, what surprises me most is how it has stayed with me, not as a good film in the conventional sense, but as a kind of symbolic text. I find myself recalling certain images, certain emotional beats, and weaving them into my own understanding of myth and narrative. For example, the way the afterlife is depicted in this film, judgment as a weighing of wealth and worth, haunted me. It felt like a cynical inversion of spiritual truth, and I couldn't stop thinking about how our modern world often confuses prosperity with virtue. It became a metaphor for me, a reminder of how art sometimes reveals our cultural anxieties more than it intends. Of course, I know many dismissed the film outright, and in a way, I understand why. Its surface is gaudy, its pacing uneven, its ambition at times greater than its execution. But that is precisely why I find it so fascinating. In literature, we often study the flawed masterpiece, works that are too ambitious for their own good, works that fail gloriously. And there is a kind of strange beauty in that failure, because it is only in overreaching that art sometimes brushes against the sublime. For me, this film stands as a reminder of why I turned to myth in the first place. Not because myths are neat or perfect, but because they are wild, contradictory, and larger than life. They demand that we wrestle with them, even when they are awkward or even absurd. Watching the story unfold felt, at times, like reading a late romantic poem, too ornate, too sentimental, too grandiose, and yet, if you surrender to its rhythm, it carries you somewhere unexpected. Somewhere emotional, somewhere beyond reason. So let us, in the chapters to come, wander together through its landscapes. Let us look at the gods and mortals not as literal characters, but as symbols of our own struggles. Let us trace the threads of betrayal, loss, redemption, and love, and ask what they reveal about us. Let us tease apart the spectacle from the substance, and see what insights are hidden beneath the surface gloss. And above all, let us remember that every flawed retelling of myth is also an invitation to revisit the timeless questions. Who are we? What do we worship? What do we fear losing most? I suppose that's why I keep returning to this film, despite everything. Because it dares to ask those questions, even if clumsily. Because it reminds me of being young and uncertain, sitting in the dark, waiting for gods to speak and hoping they might whisper something true. And because, at the end of the day, it insists that even the mightiest battles between immortals hinge on something deeply human, the love of one person for another, fragile yet unyielding. When the story begins, there is a sense of occasion, of ritual. We are plunged into a world both familiar and strange, where gods stride across the earth like men, though taller, stronger, gleaming with a radiance that marks them as otherworldly. The setting itself feels like an echo of ancient imaginings, towering monuments, vast crowds, the glitter of gold and sunlit stone. It is a coronation day, and with it, the weight of destiny presses heavily upon the land. From the first moments, I remember feeling a strange duality. On one hand, the grandeur was overwhelming, as though I were stepping into a lavish dream. On the other, there was unease, for grandeur often conceals fragility. When I first watched these opening scenes, I thought of how literature often begins with ceremony. Think of epic poems that open with invocations, or tragedies that start with a festival before dissolving into bloodshed. A coronation is not only a crowning, it is also an omen. The god who is to ascend to power embodies pride, beauty, and strength. He carries himself as one destined to rule, and in his confidence, there is almost a touch of arrogance. Yet the crowd adores him. Mortals gaze upward as if his very presence guarantees prosperity, stability, life itself. Watching that, I could not help but remember times in my own life when I, too, placed my faith in people who seemed larger than life, leaders, mentors, even friends who seemed unshakable, only to learn that such figures are always more fragile than we wish them to be. But before this crowning can be completed, the celebration is torn apart. A shadow falls across the gathering, and with it comes the villain of this tale, a god who embodies darkness, desert, and destruction. His arrival is not subtle, it is cataclysmic. The joy of the moment fractures, the pageantry collapses into chaos, and I could feel in my bones the inevitability of betrayal. In myth, there is always such a figure. The usurper, the one who interrupts the natural order. Shakespeare wrote them, Milton wrote them, and here we see the same archetype re-emerge, cinematic but familiar. The usurper does not merely arrive, he takes. With violence swift and merciless, he seizes the throne, disarming his kin in ways that feel both physical and symbolic. The proud heir, the golden one, is stripped not only of power but of sight. His very eyes, the windows of his godhood, are taken from him. I remember flinching at this moment. It felt cruel in a way that transcended spectacle. It was as though the story were saying, without vision, a god is no more than a man. I thought of how often in literature, blindness carries dual meaning. Loss of power, but also, potentially, the beginning of wisdom. With the throne stolen, the land begins to change. What was once lush and abundant begins to wither under the new ruler's tyranny. Where light shone, now shadows spread. The gods themselves bow or fall, and mortals live under the weight of cruelty. Watching it, I found myself thinking about the fragility of civilizations, how quickly peace becomes oppression when greed or fear is enthroned. It made me recall history lessons, the rise and fall of empires, and how ordinary people so often bear the cost of one man's hunger for power. But this story does not linger only with gods. Parallel to their divine struggle, we meet a mortal whose life is far humbler but no less important. A young man, orphaned, scraping by, but with a spark of courage that refuses to dim. He loves deeply, and that love anchors him. When I first encountered his thread in the film, I smiled. Because here, again, myth reveals its eternal pattern. Mortals may be fragile, but their love, their determination, can alter the course of even divine destinies. The mortal's beloved is his world, her laughter, her presence, her hope for a better future. And yet, in the cruelty of this new order, even love is not safe. Tragedy strikes with a swiftness that took my breath away the first time I watched it. She is torn from him, carried into death by forces beyond his control. In that moment, I felt the film's pulse shift. It was no longer just about crowns and battles. It became personal. Grief entered the tale, and grief, as we all know, is the great leveler. Gods may quarrel over thrones, but mortals grieve as only mortals can. The young man, devastated, refuses to accept this fate. And here is where his path crosses with that of the fallen god, the one who has been blinded, shamed, and cast into despair. One has lost power, the other has lost love, and both are bound by a shared enemy. I remember feeling almost a sense of relief here, as though the story were whispering, "See, even gods need mortals, and even mortals can demand the aid of gods." It reminded me of friendships in my own life that grew out of unlikely places, moments of shared suffering that forged bonds stronger than any formal alliance. Their partnership is uneasy at first. The god, still bitter and proud, does not see much worth in this fragile human. The mortal, fueled by love and rage, does not care much for divine arrogance. And yet, necessity binds them. Watching their first exchanges, I thought of so many classic literary pairings. Heroes and tricksters, lords and servants, masters and apprentices. The friction between them gives the story texture, and in their tension, I saw reflections of how collaboration often begins in real life. Awkwardly, reluctantly, but with the potential for transformation. As their quest begins, the film unfurls into a kind of mythic road story. They must journey across deserts, through sacred lands, into realms that shimmer with magic. Along the way, they encounter creatures and challenges that test them both. There is something almost episodic here, as though each encounter is a trial not just of strength but of character. And in these trials, I found myself paying more attention to the mortal than to the god. Because the mortal, though fragile, endures. His resilience is the quiet counterpoint to the god's grandeur. One episode that lingers in my memory is their visit to a temple, where cunning and strategy are needed as much as brute force. Watching the mortal rise to the challenge, using wit and courage where divine strength might falter, I felt a swell of admiration. It was a reminder that heroism is not measured by might alone. In literature, we often celebrate the clever underdog, the one who survives by outthinking rather than overpowering. And here, too, the mortal shines in precisely that way. Yet the journey is not without cost. The god, still blind, still wounded, stumbles often, not physically alone, but spiritually. His bitterness threatens to consume him, his pride keeps him from trusting fully. I remember feeling frustrated with him, almost as one might feel toward a friend who cannot see their own potential. But then I realized, that is the point. The blindness is not just literal. It is metaphorical. He must learn to see anew, not with stolen eyes, but with the wisdom of experience, humility, and trust. Meanwhile, the usurper tightens his grip on the land. Each scene that returns to his rule is a study in excess and cruelty. He reshapes the world to suit his own hunger, enslaving not only mortals but the very elements. I recall one moment when he unveils a monstrous creation, a symbol of his power, and I thought, here is hubris made flesh. It was unsettling, almost grotesque, and it reminded me of how myths often warn against unchecked ambition. The usurper is not content with rule. He craves dominion over everything, and in that craving, he becomes less than god, more than tyrant. As the first half of the story unfolds, we see not only battles but also seeds of transformation. The mortal begins to grow into his courage, no longer just a grieving lover but a figure of destiny. The god, begrudgingly, begins to rely on him, learning, slowly, that power without trust is hollow. Their partnership is still fragile, but it has begun to take shape. Watching this, I felt a quiet stirring because isn't this so often how our own lives work? We stumble, we resist, but in companionship, we discover strengths we never knew we had. And always, woven through their journey, is the memory of the mortal's beloved. She is not forgotten, she is the heartbeat of his quest. Every risk, every danger, every alliance is for her. And though she is gone, her presence remains like a thread of light, pulling him forward. That detail resonated with me deeply. I thought of the people I've loved and lost, and how their memory continues to guide my choices, even years later. Love, even in absence, is not passive. It propels us, shapes us, demands we keep going. By the time the first half of the tale draws toward its turning point, the pieces are in motion. The usurper grows ever more dangerous, the land more fragile, and the partnership between God and mortal more essential. We see glimpses of hope, moments where their combined strength achieves the impossible, but also shadows of doubt. The question that hangs in the air is not simply whether they can succeed, but whether they can trust, whether they can endure what lies ahead. And so the stage is set. What began with a coronation shattered by betrayal has become a journey of grief, resilience, and reluctant alliance. Gods have fallen, mortals have risen, and somewhere between them, the fate of the world trembles. As I paused after revisiting this first half, I felt a strange mix of emotions: admiration, melancholy, curiosity. For all its flaws, the story had managed to draw me in, to remind me of why we tell myths in the first place. Because myths are never really about gods alone. They are about us, our blindness and vision, our grief and hope, our endless struggle to make meaning out of chaos. The journey deepens, and as the story pushes forward, the paths of gods and mortals become ever more entangled. What began as an uneasy alliance now grows into something more, an interdependence neither could have foreseen. The mortal continues to act not only as a companion but as a moral compass, a reminder of why any of this matters. And the god, wounded still but less blind in spirit than before, begins to show cracks in his armor. I remember the first time I realized, this was no longer just about regaining a throne. It was about rediscovering what it means to fight for something greater than oneself. The quest carries them into darker territories, both literal and symbolic. The underworld looms, not as metaphor, but as a place the characters must traverse. Here, the lines between life and death blur, and the mortal is forced to confront what he lost. His beloved, gone but not gone, appears in these shadowed spaces. Watching it unfold, I thought of how myths always make us confront death head-on, not as an end but as a threshold. It reminded me of times in my own life when grief felt so tangible that it shaped my dreams, when memory itself felt like a visit to another realm. In these passages, the stakes become not only external but deeply internal. The god must wrestle with his pride, with the lingering shame of failure. The mortal must wrestle with despair, with the temptation to give up. Their trials mirror one another, echoing the old literary truth that external battles are only projections of inner struggles. I found myself nodding along with this, because haven't we all faced such dual battles? The world demands one thing, but inside, the greater war is against our own doubt, our own fear. One of the turning points that lingers vividly in my mind is when the god, still without his full power, attempts a feat he believes is impossible. For a moment, failure seems certain. Yet it is the mortal's faith, his insistence that there is another way, that pulls him through. The dynamic flips. The god becomes the student, the mortal the guide. That reversal moved me deeply. It reminded me of how often in my own life I've learned the most profound lessons from those others might overlook, from children, from friends thought ordinary, from people who had no grand titles but an abundance of wisdom. The villain, meanwhile, grows bolder. His cruelty sharpens, his ambition widens. No longer satisfied with mere earthly dominion, he hungers for cosmic power. He does not just want to rule, he wants to reshape creation itself. I remember shivering as I watched this unfold, because it struck me as such a clear metaphor for human greed. Power, once tasted, is never enough. And literature has shown us this truth countless times. Macbeth could not stop at one murder, Faust could not stop at one bargain, and here too, tyranny escalates until it threatens everything. The mortal's beloved, though dead, remains central. In the underworld, her fate hangs in the balance, subject to cruel judgments that weigh worth by wealth rather than by love or virtue. That image disturbed me profoundly. I couldn't help but think of our own world, where so often human dignity is measured by material success, where the poor are dismissed and the grieving are overlooked. Watching her soul subjected to that scale of injustice, I felt anger, but also recognition. This was not just fantasy, it was allegory. And so the mortal presses forward, determined not only to save the world but to save her. His courage is not abstract. It is personal, rooted in love. That, to me, is what makes him more compelling than any god. Gods fight for power, mortals fight for one another. And in that difference lies the heart of the story. The journey crescendos toward confrontation. Battles unfold on scales both intimate and immense. There are moments where the god, regaining fragments of his power, begins to resemble his old self, but tempered now by humility, by the knowledge that he is not invincible. There are moments where the mortal, pushed to his limits, nearly falters, but rises again out of love's fierce demand. Together, they become something neither could have been alone. I remember watching these scenes with a strange mix of awe and hope, as though I were witnessing a living metaphor for companionship itself, the idea that two broken beings, bound by shared purpose, can achieve the impossible. And then comes the great twist, the revelation that alters everything. It is not simply that the villain is strong or ruthless, it is that his hunger extends even to the cosmos, to the sun itself. He seeks to enslave the great celestial cycle, to consume creation's very heartbeat. That revelation startled me the first time, though perhaps it shouldn't have. After all, hubris always overreaches. In literature, in myth, in history, ambition, unchecked, always aims at the highest throne. And here, the highest throne is not Earth's, but the heavens. The climax builds with operatic grandeur. The god, once blinded, now fights not only for his throne but for all creation. The mortal, fragile yet unyielding, fights not only for his beloved but for every soul threatened by this tyranny. Their paths converge in a confrontation that feels both inevitable and cathartic. The villain towers, monstrous, wielding power stolen and perverted. The heroes, against all odds, stand defiant. I found myself leaning forward, heart pounding, not because I didn't know how it might end, but because the stakes felt so mythically vast. It was as if the entire cosmos hung on the outcome of a single moment. What struck me most during this climax, however, was not the spectacle, the swirling battles, the roaring chaos, but the intimacy of the choices. Again and again, the mortal is faced with decisions: to risk everything for love, to place faith in a God who once betrayed, to trust that even in the darkest moment, redemption is possible. And again, he chooses faith. That repeated choice, to me, was more powerful than any explosion of light or thunder of combat. Because faith, in love, in companionship, in hope, is the only weapon humans have against the immensity of chaos. The God, too, finds transformation here. He reclaims his strength, yes, but more importantly, he reclaims his vision, not just literal eyes, though those are restored, but an inner sight. He sees at last what true power means, not domination, but service. Not pride, but sacrifice. And when he stands against the usurper, it is not as the arrogant heir of earlier days, but as one who has learned humility through pain, who has discovered that kingship is not entitlement but responsibility. Watching that, I felt an unexpected swell of emotion. Because isn't that the lesson so many of us must learn in our own lives? That authority without humility is hollow, and that true strength lies in service to something beyond the self. The battle ends as all battles must. The villain falls, undone by his own excess, consumed by the very hunger that drove him. His empire of cruelty collapses, and with it, the land begins to breathe again. But victory is never simple. It comes at cost. There is loss along the way, sacrifices that cannot be undone. Yet there is also renewal. The beloved soul, once weighed unjustly, is released, given peace not by wealth but by love's insistence. The mortal's devotion, fierce and unwavering, breaks through the cruelty of false judgment. Watching that resolution, I felt a lump in my throat. Because it affirmed something I have always believed, that love, real love, cannot be measured by scales of wealth or power. It transcends them, and in transcending, it redeems. The God, now restored, ascends not in arrogance but in gratitude. He acknowledges the mortal, not as a pawn but as an equal in destiny. That gesture mattered to me. It was a recognition that divinity without humanity is incomplete, and that even gods must bow to the truth that love and courage dwell most fiercely in mortal hearts. I thought of friendships in my own life, of mentors who once towered above me but who, in moments of honesty, admitted that they, too, had been shaped by the faith of others. The mortal, meanwhile, finds peace, not in riches or glory, but in the assurance that his beloved is free, her soul unchained, her memory eternal. He has walked through despair, confronted gods and monsters, and emerged not unscarred but unbroken. His journey is not the story of conquest, but of devotion. And in that, I found a beauty that lingers still. When the story closes, the land breathes once more. Order, fragile yet renewed, is restored. The gods stand, humbled and changed. Mortals rise, no longer forgotten but central to the balance. And in the quiet after the storm, there is a sense of return, not to what was before, but to something wiser, deeper. Reflecting on it now, I realize that what moved me most was not the grandeur of the spectacle but the intimacy of the journey. It was the way grief became courage, the way blindness became vision, the way tyranny collapsed before the quiet insistence of love. And though I know many will dismiss the story as flawed, I cannot. Because to me, it is myth at its purest, imperfect, excessive, sometimes awkward, but pulsing with truths that reach across time. I left that final scene with a strange calm. I thought of the loved ones I have lost, of the faith I've sometimes nearly abandoned, of the moments when despair seemed stronger than hope. And I remembered, even the grandest myths are simply mirrors. They reflect back our own struggles, our own loves, our own fragile, radiant humanity. And so the story ends, not with perfection, but with meaning. Not with a flawless triumph, but with a reminder that in every myth, in every tale, what truly matters is not the throne or the crown, but the love that endures even through death, the courage that rises even when all seems lost. That is why I cherish it still. There is a way in which characters, when drawn from myth, resist becoming merely characters. They are more like symbols, archetypes dressed in human gestures. Yet in this story, for all the glitter and excess of spectacle, the figures take on a peculiar intimacy. They stumble, they grieve, they err, and because of this, they linger not just as gods or mortals but as echoes of ourselves. The fallen god, once radiant, once proud, now blinded, stands at the center of this meditation. He is the figure of pride undone, of arrogance stripped bare. When I think of him, I recall the image of Oedipus in Sophocles, blind not by birth but by fate, learning to see truth only when literal vision is gone. In the beginning, his beauty is almost unbearable, a perfection that promises leadership but conceals hubris. His fall is brutal, eyes torn away, body diminished, soul humiliated. And yet, it is in that fall that his true arc begins. I remember watching him in those early scenes, his rage palpable, his bitterness heavy, and I felt impatience with him. He seemed too proud to accept help, too wounded to move forward. But then I realized how familiar that is. Haven't we all, in moments of loss, wrapped ourselves in pride because admitting vulnerability felt unbearable? His blindness is not just physical, it is emotional. He cannot yet see the worth of those around him, nor can he yet imagine that strength lies not in perfection but in the willingness to be broken and still rise. As the story progresses, he changes in increments. First reluctantly, then more willingly, he leans on another, on a mortal no less. That reliance humbles him, and in humbling, begins to heal him. He learns that vision is not confined to eyes. To see is to trust, to recognize worth in the fragile, the finite, the human. When at last he regains his literal sight, it feels almost secondary, because by then he has already gained something more precious, the ability to look at others without arrogance. That transformation, for me, is the heart of his character. He begins as a god, but becomes human. And in becoming human, he becomes divine in a way he never was before. Opposite him stands the mortal, the young man whose courage is born not of grandeur but of love. He has no throne to reclaim, no cosmic power to wield. His motivation is heartbreakingly simple, the beloved he lost. This is what makes him, in my eyes, the truest hero of the tale. Because his strength is not abstract or symbolic. It is visceral, rooted in grief and devotion. I recall his first steps into the god's world, his defiance sharp, his desperation fierce. There was something so moving in how unpolished he was, so unlike the perfected beauty of the immortals. He falters, he doubts, he aches, and yet he presses on. In literature, mortals in myth often serve as witnesses or sidekicks, but here he is central. He is the bridge between gods and men, the reminder that all battles, however cosmic, are ultimately about the human heart. His love story haunted me most. The way he clings to the memory of his beloved, the way every risk he takes is colored by her absence, turned the narrative into more than spectacle. It became a meditation on grief's stubborn endurance. I thought of my own losses, of people I've loved who are no longer here, and I recognized in him that strange mixture of sorrow and resolve. Love does not end with death. It transforms into determination, into faith that there must be some way, however impossible, to honor the bond that once was. What I admire most about him is his refusal to be cowed. Even standing beside gods, he asserts his will. He questions, he argues, he demands. He is not merely swept along, he insists on shaping destiny with his own fragile hands. That insistence reminded me of Antigone in Greek tragedy, the mortal who, faced with divine or royal decrees, insists on the primacy of love and duty. He is not flawless, but he is faithful. And in that faith, he changes not only his own fate but the fate of gods themselves. The beloved, though absent in much of the story, is no less essential. Her presence lingers like an echo, a heartbeat behind every decision the mortal makes. What struck me about her is that she is not reduced to mere damsel or symbol. She has a strength of her own, even in death. The scenes in the underworld where she resists, where she struggles against the cruel scales that measure worth in wealth, reveal a quiet defiance. She does not yield easily to despair. Instead, she embodies the truth that love itself can resist injustice. I thought often, watching her, of Eurydice in the Orpheus myth, another beloved lost to the underworld, another soul whose fate hinges on devotion. Yet here, unlike in Orpheus's tale, the beloved is not voiceless. She is active in her struggle, her spirit refusing to fade. That mattered to me. It reminded me of women in my own life whose resilience, often unseen, shaped the course of everything around them. The villain, of course, looms large. He is the archetype of chaos, the brother who usurps, the desert that devours. His strength is immense, his cruelty unrelenting. Yet what fascinated me most was his hunger. He is not content with power, he must have more, always more. Thrones are not enough, kingdoms are not enough, he must reach for the sun itself. Watching him, I thought of Milton's Satan, of how ambition twists into monstrosity. And yet, I also felt a pang of recognition. Because isn't that hunger a distorted reflection of something we all feel? The desire for more, the dissatisfaction with limits. In him, that desire is magnified to destruction. What makes him compelling is not just his cruelty, but his insecurity. Beneath the bravado, there is a gnawing emptiness, a fear that without domination he is nothing. I recognized in that a truth about tyrants throughout history. Their hunger for power is never truly about others, it is about silencing the void within themselves. His character, then, becomes both terrifying and tragic. Terrifying because of his capacity for harm, tragic because of his endless, futile striving. Surrounding these central figures are others, gods who serve as mirrors and contrasts. Some bow quickly to tyranny, revealing how fragile loyalty is when faced with fear. Others resist, quietly or boldly, reminding us that even in divine realms, courage is rare. These supporting characters flesh out the tapestry of the tale, showing us shades of human behavior in immortal form. I thought of them almost like a chorus in Greek drama, voices that amplify the central themes without overshadowing them. One that lingers in my mind is the god of wisdom, who guides with riddles and cryptic counsel. His presence felt like an echo of Tiresias, the blind seer, offering truths wrapped in ambiguity. He reminded me that knowledge alone is never enough. It must be paired with courage, with action. Another is the goddess of love and protection, whose loyalty provides quiet strength. Two resonated with me, because her power is not in battle but in care, in devotion, a reminder that love itself is divine. What fascinates me about all these figures is how their arcs intertwine. The god learns humility from the mortal. The mortal finds strength through love. The villain reveals the emptiness of ambition. The beloved defies even death with her presence. Together, they form a cycle of fall and redemption, grief and hope, destruction and renewal. I often think of them less as individuals and more as facets of a single psyche. The god is pride. The mortal is love. The villain is hunger. The beloved is memory. Together they stage an internal drama as much as an external one, reminding us that myths are always about the human condition, no matter how grand the setting. Reflecting on them now, I find myself grateful for their imperfections. None of them are flawless. The god falters, the mortal doubts, the villain aches with insecurity, the beloved struggles against despair. And yet, it is precisely in those imperfections that their meaning lies. Perfection does not teach us. Flaws do. Watching them stumble, I felt less alone in my own stumbles, more willing to see my own griefs and prides and hungers as part of a larger human story. In the end, what lingers is not the spectacle but the intimacy of their transformations. The god who learns to see, the mortal who learns to endure, the villain who is undone by his own hunger, the beloved who proves that love transcends even death. These are the images that stay with me, not because they are flawless, but because they are true in ways that myth has always been true, exaggerated, impossible, and yet piercingly real. And so, when I think back on these characters, I do not see them only as roles in a film. I see them as reflections, as mirrors. I see in the god my own moments of pride and my own painful humblings. I see in the mortal my griefs and my stubborn faith in love. I see in the villain my own restless hungers, dangerous if left unchecked. I see in the beloved the memory of those I have lost, whose presence still shapes me. And in seeing them, I remember why we tell stories in the first place. Because characters, whether gods or mortals, are never really about themselves. They're about us. They are our fears, our hopes, our flaws, our redemptions. They are the language through which we speak the unspeakable, the faces through which we confront the truths too vast to face alone. That is what this story gave me. Not perfect characters, not flawless arcs, but mirrors. And in those mirrors, I found not escape, but recognition. There's something endlessly fascinating about looking not only at a story itself but at the strangeness that surrounds its creation. Myths on screen may dazzle us, but sometimes the truths behind the curtain are stranger still. When I think back on this film, I don't only recall its sweeping imagery and cosmic battles, I also find myself drawn to the odd details of how it came into being. The trivia, the accidents, the production decisions that seem almost mythic in their own right. They give the work a texture, a reminder that cinema is never just art but also labor, compromise, chance, and human quirk. I remember the first time I stumbled across a detail about the casting, and it struck me with peculiar force. The actors chosen to embody ancient Egyptian gods were, in many cases, of European or Australian descent. It was a decision that sparked no small amount of controversy, for obvious reasons. The irony of telling a story rooted in one of the most visually and culturally distinct civilizations, only to present it through faces so distant from that heritage, is a fact that has shadowed the film ever since. To me, this wasn't just a mistake of casting. It was a revelation about how myths are appropriated, reshaped, and sometimes distorted by the cultures that retell them. It reminded me of how, in literature, the same story can be dressed in the garb of whichever society claims it, often erasing origins in the process. Another odd fact that has always stayed with me is the scale of the sets. Although much of the film is drenched in digital spectacle, there were moments where the production built towering structures in real physical space, only to cover them with computer-generated layers later. It struck me as almost absurd, constructing a grand throne room of stone and steel, only to repaint it entirely in digital gold. And yet, there is something poetic in that. The act mirrors the film's own relationship to myth, building on foundations of the ancient, then layering modern gloss until the original is nearly obscured. The director himself often spoke of his inspirations, and what surprised me most was not the expected nods to Egyptian myth but rather his references to comic books and superhero films. The gods in this story were imagined less as remote deities and more as larger-than-life heroes, their powers exaggerated, their bodies gleaming like living sculptures. It fascinated me to learn this, because it explains so much of the film's tone. Instead of reverent archaeology, we get operatic fantasy. Instead of dusty temples, we get spandex-like grandeur. And yet, in its strangeness, that choice reveals something honest about our modern myths, that superheroes have, in many ways, replaced the pantheons of old. Then there are the costumes, extravagant to the point of surreal. One fact I recall vividly is how some of the armor pieces weighed so much that actors struggled simply to walk in them. There were reports of sequences taking hours longer to film because the ornate wings of a goddess would snag, or the heavy plating of a god's armor would leave the actor unable to sit down between takes. I thought of medieval knights, trapped in their armor, unable to rise without squires. And again, I felt the strange poetry of it. These actors, meant to embody divine perfection, were in fact groaning under the literal weight of their roles. Even the creatures born of computer effects carry peculiar stories. I once read that one of the monstrous serpents was originally designed to be half its eventual size, but when early screenings revealed that audiences laughed instead of gasped, the design was doubled, then doubled again, until it reached grotesque proportions. It's one of those odd little facts that make me smile. Even in a story about gods, the production team was scrambling like anxious mortals, trying to coax awe out of pixels. It reminded me that art, even on a grand scale, is full of improvisation, guesswork, and occasional panic. There's also the curious fact of the film's geography. Though the story is set along the Nile, almost all of the shooting took place in Australia, in sprawling studios and sun-bleached landscapes far from Africa. The desert sands were not Egyptian but Australian, the cityscapes built not in Cairo but in Sydney. Something about that amused me deeply. It felt like a metaphor for displacement, myths torn from their soil, replanted in foreign ground, then adorned with digital facades to disguise their origins. One of the strangest aspects, at least to me, was the director's insistence that the gods be taller than humans, not metaphorically, but literally. Through special effects, gods were rendered a head taller than mortals in every frame. It sounds small, but the result was eerie. The proportions seemed slightly off, as though the world itself were tilted. When I learned this was intentional, it suddenly made sense. The aim was to suggest superiority, divinity. But to me, it underscored something else, that even gods, when tampered with by technology, can become uncanny. Another curious fact: one of the actors reportedly fainted during filming of a battle sequence, not from injury but from sheer exhaustion under the heat of studio lights and heavy costume. The shoot was halted, the crew rushing to revive him, and when he returned, he joked that perhaps mortals weren't meant to wear the garments of gods. That line struck me as mythic in itself, almost as though the set had conjured its own miniature parable. And then there's the budget, which ballooned beyond what anyone predicted. Reports suggest the studio poured vast sums into reshoots, desperate to refine the effects, to polish every golden tower and every celestial chariot. But no amount of money could quite align vision with reality. That fact, too, carries symbolic weight. It's as if the film itself mirrored the story it told, gods grasping for perfection, mortals straining under the cost, and in the end, something magnificent yet flawed emerging. The music, too, holds its own curiosities. The composer originally envisioned a stripped-down score, almost minimalist, with traditional instruments and haunting silences. But the studio pushed for grandeur, for swelling orchestras and choirs that echoed blockbusters of the time. Somewhere in between, a compromise was struck. If you listen closely, you can still hear traces of that original vision. Moments where the music quiets, where a single instrument seems to mourn beneath the roar. To me, those are the most beautiful parts of the soundtrack, because they feel like glimpses of what might have been. There are even tales of on-set superstitions. Some crew members, unnerved by the subject matter, claimed odd accidents kept happening, lights blowing out, props breaking in inexplicable ways. A few whispered that the film was cursed for tampering with myths. Of course, such stories swirl around many productions, but they fascinate me nonetheless. It speaks to our enduring unease with sacred stories, our suspicion that to reshape myth is to invite mischief. Perhaps the strangest fact of all, though, is how much the film's reputation changed after its release. Dismissed at first, mocked even, it later found small communities of defenders, viewers who, like me, saw in its flaws a kind of sincerity, a boldness to attempt the impossible. I've always loved that about art, that its meaning is never fixed, that a work scorned in one era may be cherished in another. The fact that such a film, so gaudy and imperfect, could inspire serious conversations about myth, identity, and spectacle, that, to me, is the strangest and most wonderful fact of all. When I piece all these details together, the miscast gods, the heavy costumes, the inflated budget, the uncanny proportions, the whispered curses, I see a story behind the story. It is the tale of mortals trying to paint gods, of filmmakers reaching for grandeur and stumbling into excess, of art created not in pristine temples but in messy studios under hot lights. And isn't that, in its own way, beautiful? That even myths, when retold, are shaped by accidents, by exhaustion, by laughter and failure and persistence. Cinema is never just the finished image on screen. It is also the sweat beneath the costumes, the panic of reshoots, the arguments in sound studios, the fainting actor, the director's stubborn vision, the crew's whispered fears. To me, those facts are not trivia. They are the texture of the myth's modern life. They remind us that behind every glittering god is a tired human in a costume too heavy, behind every towering temple is plywood and paint, behind every dazzling effect is a programmer scrambling late into the night. And when I remember this film now, I don't only remember its story of gods and mortals. I remember the humans who tried to build a new myth, who argued over music, who sweated in armor, who whispered of curses, who turned deserts into Egypt and mortals into giants. Those strangest facts are not distractions. They are part of the tale. They remind me that even flawed stories have their own kind of magic, not just in what they tell us, but in how they were made. There are moments in certain films that remain lodged in memory not because of their perfection but because of their strange power to stir something inside us, to provoke, to unsettle, or to console. When I think about this particular film, I realize that its significant events linger with me not as isolated spectacles but as layered texts, like fragments of a myth rewritten in neon ink. Each event begs to be unpacked, to be seen not merely as a beat in the plot but as a gesture in an ongoing conversation between ancient stories and modern sensibilities. It's that dialogue, messy and imperfect as it is, that gives the film its peculiar impact. The opening coronation is one of the first of these events that commands attention. At first glance, it feels like a familiar trope, a grand ritual, a kingdom poised on the edge of renewal, the promise of continuity embodied in a god's succession to the throne. The spectacle is overwhelming, gold gleaming, crowds rejoicing, the weight of divine ceremony filling every corner of the frame. Yet beneath the glitter lies an unease. The ritual of power always carries with it the shadow of disruption, and here, disruption takes the form of an uninvited guest, the darker brother, the one who has lived in the margins of desert and shadow, crashing the celebration with violence. What strikes me critically about this moment is not just its dramatic intensity but its resonance with countless myths and histories where coronations turn into tragedies. Shakespeare's plays are full of such scenes, moments when order, symbolized by ritual, is shattered by ambition. The coronation is supposed to affirm continuity, but instead it exposes fragility. Power, no matter how divinely ordained, is always precarious. That's the lesson I read into this opening. The gods themselves are not immune to betrayal, and their rituals, for all their grandeur, are as vulnerable as human ceremonies. The brutal dethroning that follows is shocking not only for its violence but also for its symbolism. The stripping away of eyes, such a grotesque, almost unbearable act, resonates with mythic punishments across cultures. To blind is not just to wound physically, it is to cut off sight, to sever perception, to humiliate. From Oedipus piercing his own eyes in despair to Samson losing his vision at the hands of enemies, blindness has long symbolized a fall from power, a collapse of certainty. Here, that motif is replayed in a modern mythic key, and it forces us to confront the fragility of beauty, of strength, of authority. The fall is swift and merciless, reminding us that gods in this world are not eternal but precariously balanced beings. From a critical perspective, this event sets the tone for the film's thematic undercurrent, the fragility of divinity. If gods can be maimed, dethroned, and cast down, then what separates them from mortals? The answer, as the film unravels, is less than we imagine. And this erosion of boundaries between God and human becomes, to me, the central philosophical tension of the narrative. Into this fractured world steps the mortal hero, whose introduction shifts the scale of events from cosmic to intimate. His motivation is not empire or dominion but love, personal, grounded, achingly human. His presence among gods is jarring at first, like a figure from another genre stumbling into a fantasy epic. Yet that very contrast is what gives his actions weight. His grief, his yearning, remind us that all the gilded temples and thrones ultimately mean little compared to the love of one mortal for another. There's a particular moment when he stands before the fallen god, bargaining, pleading, demanding cooperation. To me, that scene encapsulates the film's strange charm. Here is a mortal with no divine power, daring to speak as equal to one once worshipped. It recalls the tragedies of antiquity where mortals defy gods, insisting on their own agency. Think of Antigone before Creon, or Prometheus before Zeus. In each case, the mortal's defiance cracks open the illusion of absolute authority. Here, too, defiance elevates the mortal beyond mere sidekick. He becomes the heart of the story, the reminder that love can place even gods in its shadow. The journey that follows, through deserts and across impossible landscapes, contains its own series of critical moments worth unpacking. One that lingers is the battle with the colossal serpents, creatures of chaos, born of nightmares, unleashed to crush the unlikely pair. On the surface, it's pure spectacle, flames, scales, teeth, and the desperate scramble for survival. But beneath the spectacle, there is symbolism. Serpents, across mythologies, embody chaos, temptation, danger. To face them is to confront the raw forces of disorder that threaten both mortals and gods. I find it significant that this confrontation is not won by divine strength alone but by the combined efforts of the blind god and the fragile mortal. This cooperation reframes power itself. Divinity without humanity falters. Humanity without divinity perishes. Only in collaboration do they succeed. The event, then, becomes an allegory for balance, the idea that neither godly arrogance nor human frailty is sufficient alone. Together, however, they can overcome chaos. One cannot ignore the descent into the underworld, an event steeped in mythic resonance. The underworld journey is as old as storytelling itself, from Gilgamesh to Orpheus to Dante. Here, it becomes not just a backdrop but a critical space where love and justice collide. The scales weighing souls not by virtue but by wealth stand as one of the most searing critiques embedded in the film. It is a grotesque parody of justice, a corruption that mirrors our own world's obsession with material worth. Watching souls cast aside, condemned for poverty rather than sin, I felt the sharp sting of allegory. How many of our own systems of justice, of opportunity, still hinge on wealth rather than worth? The beloved's defiance in that realm moved me deeply. She is no passive victim but a voice of resistance, refusing to accept unjust judgment, refusing to let love be measured in gold. Her stand, though subtle, transforms the underworld event into a critique not only of divine corruption but of human systems. For me, this was one of the film's most powerful and overlooked contributions, the reminder that injustice dressed as law is still injustice. Later, as the narrative builds toward its climactic confrontation, another significant event demands attention: the villain's attempt to ascend beyond his stolen throne, to seize not only dominion over gods but mastery of the very sun. This ambition feels almost absurd in its grandeur, and yet it resonates with literary archetypes of overreaching figures: Faust, Icarus, Lucifer. The hunger to grasp what should remain untouchable is a recurring theme in human storytelling, a mirror of our own restless striving. From a critical angle, this ambition exposes the hollowness of the villain's character. He is not driven by love or justice or even survival. He is driven by hunger alone, a hunger that can never be sated. His attempt to control the sun is both literal and metaphorical. He seeks to extinguish limits, to devour eternity itself. And in that striving, he ensures his own undoing. Watching him, I was reminded of how often in history and literature the greatest tyrants fall not because of external enemies but because of the weight of their own insatiable ambition. The climactic battle itself, for all its dazzling effects, resonates most for me not in its spectacle but in its symbolic reversals. The once blind god, who could not see, now perceives with clarity not only his enemies but his allies. The mortal, once dismissed as insignificant, stands central to the outcome. The villain, who believed himself invincible, reveals his vulnerability. Each role is inverted, each identity reshaped by the events that led here. This, to me, is the essence of narrative transformation. The characters are not the same beings they were at the start, and the events that shaped them reverberate beyond their immediate consequences. What lingers after the final confrontation is not the noise of battle but the quiet resolution that follows. The restoration of balance, the honoring of the mortal's love, the acknowledgement of human worth in a world of gods. These are the notes that stay. Critically, I see in this resolution a deliberate subversion of traditional myth, where mortals often remain pawns or casualties. Here, the mortal's love reshapes divine destinies, his grief carving new possibilities even in the realm of gods. That shift is profound, a reimagining of myth for a modern sensibility that longs to see humanity not as insignificant but as central. And yet, the impact of these events cannot be considered without acknowledging how they were received. For many viewers, the spectacle overwhelmed the symbolism, the gaudy surfaces obscured the allegorical depths. Critics, too, often dismiss the narrative as bloated fantasy, missing the subtle critiques embedded within. This, to me, speaks to the tension of art itself, the balance between surface and depth, between entertainment and meaning. The film may not always succeed in balancing those elements, but when it does, the results are surprisingly potent. Thematically, the film's events converge on a few resonant threads: the fragility of power, the persistence of love, the corruption of justice, the peril of ambition. Each event, when viewed critically, contributes to these themes in its own way. The coronation shows power's fragility. The blinding reveals the limits of perfection. The mortal's defiance embodies love's endurance. The underworld exposes corruption. The villain's ascent warns against ambition. The final resolution affirms humanity's centrality. Together, these events form a tapestry not just of spectacle but of meaning. What makes them resonate emotionally, at least for me, is their reflection of lived experience. Who among us has not felt dethroned in some way, stripped of certainty, humbled? Who has not fought serpents of chaos, whether literal or emotional, with the help of unexpected allies? Who has not stood before unjust scales, watching worth reduced to wealth, yearning for justice? Who has not seen ambition consume those who reach too high? These events are strange and fantastical, yes, but they echo truths we recognize in ourselves and our world. And that, I think, is where the film's true impact lies. Not in flawless execution, not in seamless effects, but in its willingness to grapple with enduring human themes through the lens of myth. Its events are not just plot points, they are symbols, mirrors, invitations to reflection. Even when imperfect, even when wrapped in gaudy spectacle, they carry weight because they touch something timeless. When I reflect on these events critically, I find myself less concerned with whether the film succeeded in the eyes of reviewers and more concerned with what it stirred in me. The coronation reminded me of how fragile our rituals of power are. The blinding reminded me of how loss can teach us to see differently. The mortal's love reminded me of my own attachments, my own griefs. The underworld reminded me of the injustices we still live with. The villain's ambition reminded me of the dangers of insatiable hunger. And the resolution reminded me that even amidst gods, human love matters most. In the end, these events do more than tell a story. They weave a meditation on power, love, justice, ambition, and humanity itself. They remind me that films, even flawed ones, can be more than entertainment. They can be parables, mirrors, conversations across time. And though the reception may have been mixed, the resonance remains, at least for those of us willing to look beneath the surface. Because cinema, like myth, is never just about what happens on screen. It is about what those events awaken in us. And for me, these events, strange and spectacular as they are, awakened questions, emotions, and reflections that linger long after the credits rolled. That, perhaps, is the film's truest achievement. When I think about the making of certain films, I realize that the story of how they came into being is often just as fascinating, sometimes even more so, than the story that eventually unfolds on screen. The production itself becomes a kind of parallel myth, full of struggles, accidents, ambition, and moments of sheer absurdity. This particular film is no exception. In fact, the deeper I've gone into its production, the more I've felt that the behind-the-scenes journey deserves to be told like a story of its own. What we see on screen, the shimmering temples, the cosmic battles, the soaring gods, is only one half of the narrative. The other half took place under hot lights, in echoing studios, in editing rooms where exhausted eyes tried to stitch together visions of grandeur. It all began with a dream that was, in many ways, larger than life. The director, known for his appetite for spectacle, wanted to create a modern myth, a story that would stand shoulder to shoulder with the great cinematic epics of decades past. From the beginning, the vision was unapologetically grand. He imagined not merely a retelling of ancient lore but a full reimagining, drenched in color and digital wonder. It was ambitious to the point of audacity, and perhaps that was its most defining feature, the sheer scale of the dream. One of the most striking insights into the production was how much of it was shaped by technology. Unlike older epics, where vast deserts and stone temples were filmed in painstaking physical reality, here the choice was made to lean heavily on computer-generated imagery. But it wasn't just a matter of adding a flourish here or there. Entire worlds were built inside computers. This required the actors to spend much of their time on sound stages surrounded by green screens, gesturing toward creatures that weren't there, walking on platforms that would later become golden staircases or celestial bridges. I always marvel at this part of the filmmaking process, the leap of faith required of actors, to perform with conviction in spaces that must have felt empty, to imagine worlds that would only exist months later when digital artists conjured them into being. I can almost picture those long days in the studio. A massive warehouse in Australia converted into an otherworldly stage, with lights burning hot above, crews bustling, wires and rigs snaking across the floor. An actor, dressed in ornate armor that gleamed under studio lamps, delivering lines to a tennis ball perched atop a stick, because that tennis ball represented the eye line of a serpent or a god not yet rendered. There's something almost comical about that image, yet also something deeply moving. It speaks to the imaginative courage of acting, the willingness to step into nothingness and pretend it is everything. The costumes themselves are another fascinating layer of the story. They were designed not just as clothing but as embodiments of divinity, lavish creations brimming with detail. Yet many of them were notoriously impractical. Some armor pieces weighed so much that actors could barely walk in them. One story tells of an actor whose grand winged costume was so unwieldy that crew members had to support him just to move across the set. Imagine the irony, gods, intended to tower with effortless grace, being held up by stagehands just out of frame. To me, this is one of those delightful paradoxes of filmmaking, the contrast between what we see on screen and what was actually happening just outside the camera's view. There were also moments of physical strain. One actor fainted during a particularly grueling day of filming under heavy lights and heavier armor. Production halted, medics rushed in, and after some rest, he joked that no mortal was meant to carry the weight of a god. That line, overheard by crew members, became a kind of inside joke on set, whispered whenever costumes refused to cooperate or props collapsed under their own weight. Then there are the stories about the sets themselves. While much of the world was constructed digitally, certain key spaces were built physically. Towering columns, golden thrones, and elaborate staircases were raised inside the studio, not because they were strictly necessary, but because the director wanted the actors to feel at least some tangible reality under their feet. The irony, of course, is that many of these painstakingly crafted structures were later covered with digital embellishments, their original textures erased. And yet, in their time, they gave the actors something to hold on to, something to anchor performances that might otherwise have floated away into the abstraction of green screens. The filming in Australia provided its own share of anecdotes. Crew members spoke of the sheer oddity of creating an Egypt on the other side of the world, with landscapes that bore little resemblance to the Nile's ancient banks. Local workers found themselves helping to shape temples and pyramids, their accents and humor bringing a distinctly Australian flavor to the atmosphere on set. I imagine there must have been moments when the incongruity struck everyone, filming a myth of the desert while parrots squawked in the distance, or while storms swept across the unfamiliar landscape. One of the strangest production decisions, and one that still fascinates me, was the choice to depict gods as physically larger than mortals, not metaphorically, but literally on screen. This required careful planning of every scene, with camera angles, props, and digital adjustments all designed to maintain the illusion. Actors playing gods had to move differently, speak with a certain gravitas, and sometimes perform scenes twice. once at their own height and once adjusted for scale. The result, for some viewers, was uncanny, gods who looked just slightly too large, as though the world around them were shrinking. To me, this creative choice is revealing. It shows the filmmaker's determination to distinguish gods from mortals in visual, tangible ways, even at the risk of strangeness. Then there were the challenges of the film's massive visual effects team. Hundreds of artists labored across continents, crafting every detail of the world, from the shimmer of gold on a temple wall to the terrifying scales of a serpent. I think about those long hours in dimly lit rooms, artists clicking and dragging with precision, layering texture upon texture. Their names flash by in the credits, often unnoticed, but their labor shaped every frame. And, as with many such productions, deadlines loomed, revisions multiplied, and the sheer scale of the digital canvas sometimes overwhelmed even the most seasoned teams. There's something almost mythic about that labor too, an army of modern scribes, writing a new mythology in pixels instead of ink. The music added another fascinating dimension. Originally, the composer wanted to craft something intimate and haunting, with subtle nods to ancient instrumentation. But as production evolved, the push for spectacle grew louder. The result was a score that swelled with orchestral thunder, choirs echoing like temples collapsing. And yet, if you listen carefully, you can still catch glimpses of that earlier vision, the quieter moments where a single flute or string line carries the weight of emotion. Those fragments feel like secret whispers from the production's early days, before spectacle overwhelmed subtlety. Of course, no production of this size is without its controversies. The casting decisions sparked criticism long before the film's release, and the production team was forced to confront questions about representation and cultural authenticity. Apologies were issued, promises made, but the shadow lingered. For me, this aspect of the production is one of the most revealing. It shows how myths, when retold in modern contexts, cannot escape the politics of their telling. Who gets to play a god? Who gets to embody ancient stories? These questions are not abstract. They are bound to the realities of our time, and the production's struggles with them are part of its story too. Then there are the little quirks, the kinds of fun facts that feel almost too strange to be true. At one point, a crew member brought in a real snake to help animators capture authentic movement for the giant serpents. The snake promptly escaped its container, sending half the set into chaos until it was retrieved. Another time, a prop meant to represent a god's weapon broke in the middle of filming, and rather than halt production, the actor improvised, swinging the broken piece in such a convincing way that the scene made it into early cuts. Even the editing process had its stories. The first assembled cut reportedly ran far longer than the theatrical version, filled with subplots and extended sequences that never saw the light of day. Entire arcs were trimmed, whole characters minimized, all in the effort to create a tighter pace. I sometimes wonder what those lost scenes contained, what nuances we might have seen if the film had been allowed to breathe longer. The thought of those unseen hours lingers like an alternate myth, hidden in vaults somewhere. What stays with me most, though, is the image of the crew, dozens, sometimes hundreds of people, working in unison to bring a single frame to life. The electricians adjusting lights, the costume designers stitching sequins at the last moment, the stunt coordinators rehearsing impossible falls, the assistants running to fetch coffee for weary actors. These lives, these efforts, all converge to create the illusion of gods and mortals. And that, in its own way, is magical. Behind every towering pyramid on screen was a carpenter's hand, behind every glowing sky a programmer's late-night adjustment. The production itself becomes a myth of collaboration, of humans striving to capture something larger than themselves. When I reflect on these insights and anecdotes, I realize that they make me appreciate the film in a way I couldn't have if I had only seen the final product. Knowing that an actor collapsed under the heat, that costumes were too heavy to move in, that digital artists labored endlessly, that jokes and accidents shaped scenes, it makes the story feel alive in new ways. It reminds me that cinema is not the work of gods but of mortals, and that its miracles are built from sweat, laughter, exhaustion, and imagination. Perhaps that is the most fun fact of all, that the film, for all its talk of divinity, was crafted entirely by human hands, flawed and brilliant. And when I think of it now, I don't just see the shimmering world of the story, I see the green screens, the fainting actors, the broken props, the snakes slithering free, the exhausted animators, the musicians slipping fragments of intimacy into a thunderous score. That is the true mythology of its making. When I think back to the first time I sat down to watch this film, what struck me wasn't only the characters, or even the winding arc of the story itself. It was the world, the sheer audacity of it, the way it stretched and shimmered across the screen like a dream caught halfway between reality and myth. The settings were unlike anything I had seen before. They didn't try to imitate history in a literal way. Instead, they leaned into fantasy, into spectacle, into the impossible grandeur of imagined worlds. And that, perhaps more than anything else, was what made the film linger in my mind. It wasn't just telling a story, it was asking me to step into another cosmos entirely, to suspend disbelief and accept that the sun could be pulled across the sky by a god on a barge, that rivers could turn to gold, that palaces could reach higher than mountains. The settings themselves become characters here, full of contradictions, sometimes majestic, sometimes overwhelming, sometimes even alienating. Each new landscape feels like a doorway, a place where the narrative pauses to remind us that myths are not bound by geography. I remember feeling both awe and unease as I looked upon these shimmering cities and endless deserts, and I think that reaction was intentional. This was not meant to be the Egypt of history books. It was an Egypt of imagination, a heightened stage upon which gods and mortals could play out their eternal conflicts. The first city we encounter is a marvel of verticality. Temples rise like towers, golden rooftops glint in the blazing sun, and streets seem carved from perfection itself. Yet, if you look closely, there is something strange in its perfection, a kind of symmetry that feels almost too deliberate, as though this city was built not for humans but for deities to admire themselves. Cinematically, the camera lingers on these sweeping vistas, moving with a slow, deliberate glide, as though it too is worshipping the architecture. The color palette is rich with gold and ivory, bathing the city in warmth, but also creating an atmosphere of untouchable grandeur. Watching it, I found myself torn between admiration and distance. Beautiful though it was, I felt like an outsider, peering into a world never meant for me. And then there is the desert. Vast, endless, and yet strangely stylized, it doesn't look like the deserts I know from real landscapes. The sand gleams almost unnaturally, the dunes curve with exaggerated elegance, and the horizon stretches impossibly far. There are moments where the desert feels like a blank canvas, a space upon which gods can inscribe their battles. Other times, it feels oppressive, a reminder of the isolation and danger that mortals must face when they leave the safety of cities. The cinematography here often shifts to wider shots, pulling back so that human figures look fragile against the immensity of the sand. It creates a mood of smallness, of vulnerability, and I remember feeling a pang of empathy for the characters who had to cross it, as though I too were walking under that merciless sun. One of the most fascinating settings is the underworld. This space is not depicted as a place of darkness and decay, as in many traditions, but as a realm of order and judgment. Gates rise impossibly high, guarded by strange figures, and the skies shimmer with a hue that is neither day nor night. The cinematography here shifts again. The lighting grows colder, shadows stretch longer, and the camera angles tilt slightly, giving the sense that this world obeys laws different from our own. I felt unsettled watching it, as though I had stepped into a place where the rules of existence had been rewritten. And yet, there was also a kind of elegance, a beauty in its austerity, that made it unforgettable. Equally striking are the celestial settings. The sky itself becomes a stage, with the sun carried across the heavens on a barge by a god whose task is both noble and exhausting. Here, the cinematography does something bold. It blurs the line between the cosmic and the earthly, cutting between wide shots of the universe itself and close-ups of the divine labor required to keep it running. The colors explode, deep blues, fiery oranges, radiant golds, painting the heavens as both dangerous and breathtaking. Watching those sequences, I felt a childlike wonder, as though I were being reminded of the stories I once heard when looking up at the night sky. But the film doesn't only rely on grand landscapes. Some of its most intriguing moments happen in smaller, more intimate settings, a workshop where a mortal tinkers with inventions, a chamber where whispered conspiracies unfold, a quiet riverside where two characters pause in their journey. The cinematography adjusts here, focusing tightly on faces, dimming the overwhelming brightness, letting shadows and soft light do the storytelling. These moments of intimacy give the story its human pulse. Without them, the grandiose settings might have drowned the characters. Instead, these quieter spaces provide contrast, reminding us that even in a world of gods, it is the human-scale moments that ground the tale. The use of color throughout the film is worth lingering on. Gold dominates, symbolizing divinity, wealth, and untouchable splendor. But against that gold are bursts of red, violence, passion, betrayal, and swathes of blue, often marking the boundary between mortal and divine spaces. The interplay of these colors isn't subtle, but it doesn't need to be. In a myth, everything is heightened, emotions are painted in broad strokes, and the visuals follow suit. I found myself reading the colors almost as though they were part of the dialogue, speaking truths that the characters themselves sometimes could not. Lighting plays an equally crucial role. Scenes of triumph are drenched in sunlight, glowing so brightly it almost hurts to look. Scenes of despair retreat into shadow, with flickering firelight casting uneasy patterns on the walls. The cinematography constantly contrasts light and dark, not just for visual beauty, but to underline the moral and emotional stakes of the story. Watching it, I felt the shifts in my own body, shoulders tensing during the shadowed scenes, breath easing when light returned. That's the power of visual storytelling. It bypasses intellect and speaks directly to feeling. The camera movement itself deserves mention. In moments of grandeur, it soars, swooping across landscapes, gliding upward to capture impossible heights. In moments of intimacy, it steadies, slows, lingers. This dynamic rhythm keeps the story from becoming monotonous. It mirrors the pulse of myth, vast, cosmic struggles alternating with quiet, personal moments. I often think of this rhythm as music. Each sweeping pan is a crescendo, each lingering close-up a pause for breath. The film dances between them, and the audience is carried along almost without noticing. What fascinates me most about the settings and cinematic elements is how they blur the line between reality and imagination. This is not a faithful reconstruction of ancient times. It is an interpretation, an act of storytelling that uses imagery to evoke feeling rather than accuracy. Some viewers found this disorienting, even frustrating. But I found it liberating. It reminded me that myths are not about literal history. They are about meaning, about resonance, about images so exaggerated they strike something deep in the soul. And that, I think, is why the film chose such audacious settings and such extravagant cinematography. It wanted to remind us that we are not just watching a story, we are stepping into a myth. There's also something profoundly human about how these visuals sometimes falter. The reliance on computer-generated imagery means there are moments where the illusion wavers, where the sheen feels artificial. And yet, I find even those imperfections compelling. They remind me that what I'm seeing is an act of creation, the result of hundreds of hands and minds trying to conjure the impossible. The shimmering temples and celestial skies are not real, but they carry the weight of human effort, imagination, and ambition. That, to me, is beautiful. As I reflect on the settings, I realize they are not mere backdrops. They are active participants in the storytelling, shaping the atmosphere, influencing the mood, and reminding us of the stakes. A desert that stretches endlessly tells us of the futility of mortal effort. A golden palace that towers too high warns us of arrogance. An underworld that tilts reality makes us question the stability of our own. Each setting is a metaphor, and the cinematography knows it, leaning into exaggeration not as a flaw, but as a feature. By the end of the film, I felt as though I had traveled not just across a narrative, but across a gallery of images, each carefully chosen to resonate, to provoke, to awe. The settings stayed with me long after the credits rolled, not because they were realistic, but because they dared to be unreal, to push beyond what is possible and invite me into the realm of myth. The cinematography carried me there, guiding my gaze, shaping my emotions, and weaving a visual rhythm that felt as essential as the story itself. And so, when I look back, I don't just recall the characters or the battles. I recall the golden glow of temples at sunset, the endless expanse of the desert, the eerie tilt of the underworld, the blaze of the sun barge against a cosmic sky. These are the images that linger, the ones that whisper to me when I close my eyes. They remind me that cinema, at its best, is not just about telling a story. It's about building a world so vivid, so strange, so full of meaning, that it becomes a myth in its own right.